My name is Forrest Fleischman. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota. And broadly, I think my job title says that I'm a professor of environmental and natural resource policy. But I think a lot of people don't know what it means to be a professor of policy. And what it means is I study what policies are, how effective they are at achieving their goals, and how they get made, obviously in reference to forests and other natural resources. So broadly, I'm interested in sort of political decision-making processes and then what the impact of those processes are on the environment. I have a few lines of research that are very active right now. One is that I've been studying forest restoration programs around the world. And in particular, the ones I've looked at the most are in South Asia, in India. And we're trying to understand how effective they are. And unfortunately, we're finding a lot of these very prominent forest restoration programs that you read about in the news sometimes are not very effective at achieving their goals and sometimes have some pretty negative unintended consequences. Then I have another line of research that's looking at the U.S. Forest Service system and how they make decisions, how they use science in their decisions, and how those decisions could be made better. And finally, I would say the third sort of major piece is looking at environmental advocacy in Minnesota and trying to understand what kinds of environmental policies are people advocating and how are they advocating for them. And I've been doing a lot of that work in particular with regards to nature in the Twin Cities metro. So things around parks, street trees, and urban pollution issues. So my name is Forrest. I'm in the Department of Forest Resources and I study forestry. I think that it's in some way just a coincidence, but I would say that my parents liked the name for some reason, and they also raised me in a way for some reason that I spent a lot of time out in the woods, that I felt a strong connection to nature because of what I did with my parents as a child. And so I think that the combination of those factors contributed to my being interested in nature, but I don't know that that necessarily would have led to me ending up in a forestry department. That's sort of more of a coincidence. I grew up in New England, in Massachusetts and Vermont. And so I think of these places I grew up, which are actually very heavily forested. People think of the northeastern US as being urbanized, but the areas I grew up in were rural. And, you're always in and around trees and shrubs and this thick, rich dirt that in New England is very glaciated. So it's actually very thin. There's a lot of rock. And for me, that's what inspired me to study forests. And it's still sort of what I go back to when I think of forests, is these places I grew up in that have this very rich and beautiful forests. So, I think it's the trees, but also everything that's around the trees and the other plants and the animals and the whole atmosphere that they create. So the question is, why do forests matter and what's their importance? And I think that forests matter for a lot of reasons. I would say I tend to think of forests mattering at a global level down to a local level in different ways. So at a global level, forests play a really important role in regulating our climate, in regulating our water cycle, in regulating how other nutrients move through the environment. And we need that. That's part of what makes the whole Earth livable. And so that's very important. At the local level, you go to a lot of forests in the world, and someone's livelihood depends on that forest. And it may be, in Minnesota, we tend to think of that in terms of someone harvesting timber. But there's also people here who hunt or fish, and they depend on the people also graze their animals in the forest. And when I first heard that, I thought, that's kind of weird, grazing cows in the forest. But there's a lot of edible plants in the forest, and these are often not very dense forests. So there's a lot of undergrowth that the cattle and goats can eat. And those animals are very important parts of people's livelihoods and well-being. And of course, there's also wild foods of various kinds that grow in forests. Here we have like wild blueberries and such. So I see that whole spectrum, and kind of in the middle, there's often people care about the wildlife and the forests. And then for many people, forests have a spiritual function. You could meet a lot of well-off people who live in the middle of a city, and they want to go to a forest every weekend because they feel like it has some meaning. And if you go to poor rural people in many parts of the world, you'll find not the same necessarily, but some similar kinds of feelings about the forest. In India, they often talk about there being gods in the forest, and some of those gods are helpful, some of them are dangerous, but that there's a presence of the divine for them in the forest. So I think that whole spectrum of how and why forests matter. I think that people widely understand that forests are important or valuable. I hear a lot of misstatements of their importance. So I'll often hear that forests give us oxygen, and that's kind of true, but it's kind of not quite true. Forests do play an important role in the cycling of various nutrients, including oxygen. But if we cut down all the forests in the world, we wouldn't run out of oxygen. They do play a role in sequestering carbon dioxide and various other pollutants. So there's some confusion there in their role that seems to be widespread. I've also heard people tell me that forests stop the ozone layer, and that's another confusion, and the ozone layer issues are not related to forests. So I think that there's some general understanding that forests are really valuable, although some of these specifics people often misunderstand. And then I think there's often a misunderstanding about what makes a forest. And so some people feel like, well, because trees are the thing that define a forest is trees. So people often confuse planting trees as being like how you create a forest. You can create a forest by planting trees, but they're not really equivalent. You can also create an orchard by planting trees, for example. The forest refers to the whole system around the trees, not just the trees themselves. Continuing on that line, I think sometimes people think that we should have forests everywhere because forests are good. And there's a lot of ecosystems that are not naturally forested, and that's good. We shouldn't want there to be forests everywhere. We should want there to be forests where they belong. I would say a broad answer is no, although I think in the US, maybe they're not as bad, but around the world, we continue to lose forests. The reason we lose forests is primarily, so people often have a confusion. They think of logging as being how forests are lost, but most logging operations in the world are sustainable in the sense that if people can make money off of harvesting the forest, they want it to continue to be forest. And so they'll encourage that forest to grow back. But where we really have a very big concern is when forests are converted to agriculture. And so around the world, there's a lot of demand for agricultural products. And including here in the US, we want to make things out of palm oil, and we want to make things out of soybeans. Those are crops that are being planted in tropical forest areas, and we're clearing tropical forests to create them. We know quite a bit about policies that we can follow to reduce that forest clearing, and one thing is reducing demand for forest clearing derived products. Big ones are palm oil, which is used in a lot of manufactured foods, soybean, which is mainly fed to animals that we eat as meat, and beef cattle. Those are our three major ones. So, as a society, if we decide that we're going to consume less of those animals and products, or if we decide we're going to consume them, but we're going to make sure that they're not coming from places where they're driving deforestation, that can be a very good thing. There's also things that national governments can do to protect forests from clearing. One of the things that we've found very consistently is where indigenous and forest-dependent people have land rights and control their forests that they live in and depend on, those forests tend to be conserved better than forests that are, say, protected by a national government or owned by a private citizen. We're studying now there isn't a lot of study of what can we do to effectively encourage reforestation. Some people are very focused on giving people incentives to reforest their land. I don't think it's very clear if that works. That's a very popular policy right now, but I think the jury is still out on whether that's a functional policy. What we do see is people reforest their land when there are business reasons to do so. Sometimes there's reforestation that's required by law in some countries, and that's often effective where there's enforcement. But there's often people are reforesting their land because the value of forest products is higher than the value of the agricultural products that they can grow on that same land. Or people are reforesting their land because they used to depend on farming, but now they've found other livelihoods. Say they've gotten an education and they were able to move to an urban area and get a job in an urban area. They own land in a rural area, but they may say, well, I don't have time to farm it anymore. But if I reforest it, then I can have less work and eventually I can also make some money off of the forest. So those are some of the policies that can work well that we've seen. In the US, we are losing some forests, and we have a very effective system of public land management in the United States. National lands, state lands. In Minnesota, we also have county lands. And those don't allow conversion to agriculture, so we're often very effective. We also have a lot of programs that encourage forest landowners to maintain their land as forests. So one of the most common, a lot of states have programs that reduce the tax burden of people who own and manage their forests, so that the land is taxed for its value as a forest, as opposed to being taxed for its value as a potential site for urban development, for example. Well, I think, going back to what I said about policies, if you think about what are the main drivers of the destruction of nature in the world, it's overconsumption of resources. And those of us who live in wealthy countries are the people, and those of us who live in wealthy states like Minnesota, and those of us who have more money, we are the drivers of all this loss of nature. It's our consumption patterns. And so thinking about how we can consume less, and I think that's the most important, just consuming less stuff and making sure that the stuff that we do consume is of a quality that it lasts a long time and that it's stuff that we really need.